So the key question, no one doubts that people who come to counselling or receive psychiatric services are in great distress. They may be extremely confused and low in mood, have serious relationship difficulties or disabling panic attacks and so on. Sometimes they are tormented by hostile voices or have terrifying mood swings, but are they suffering from medical illnesses that need diagnosing? Or do we need completely different ways of understanding their distress which are not based on diagnosis? And if so, what might those ways be? So to be really, really clear, the distress is real. There's a lot of muddle thinking about this, isn't there? The distress is real. The explanations are up for question. Two important messages. Few people can afford to give up diagnosis entirely. We live in a diagnostically based system. It is needed, or something rather similar is needed for access to benefits, services and so on. But people may decide they do not wish to define themselves and their problems in this way. You may decide, I do not want to take on the belief that I am suffering from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or personality disorder or major depressive disorder or any of that stuff, and that you do not want to take on the identity of someone who is mentally ill, which is not a highly valued identity and comes with many, many significant disadvantages. And that should be up to you. You can only make that choice if you're clear about the arguments. Okay, but these are very complex discussions. I hope you don't waste as much time on Twitter as I do, but you can see that it's almost impossible to raise these questions at all without being accused, as I have on many, many occasions, of silencing and vilifying and attacking service users and shaming people for taking pills and all the rest of it. It's like, and the underlying message is quite disturbing, I think, from some people, that we are not allowed to have these discussions. Well, I think we have to have these discussions. Many times I've been told how divisive it is to have these discussions. The most important discussions that we need to have are divisive by their nature. You know, think about abortion in Ireland. You know, we have to have these discussions. But as a society, this is a quote from my book, we seem to find it hard to find a middle ground between you have a physical illness and therefore your distress is real and no one is to blame for it, and your difficulties are imaginary and or you're someone else's fault and you ought to pull yourself together. Are you familiar with that kind of dichotomy? As soon as anyone asks questions, it's like you're blaming people, undermining them, telling them to pull themselves together. This is sometimes called the brain or blame trap. If it's not my brain, then I or someone else must be to blame. And we all feel very uncomfortable about that. In America, they call it chemistry or character. And my question is, could there be a middle ground? A ground which is about understanding how people got to the situations that they're in, which doesn't involve blame, but doesn't simply attribute it to some hypothesized but never evidenced malfunction in their brains or whatever. A lot of these arguments came to a head with the publication of DSM-5 in May 2013. Most of you will know that DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is sometimes called the Bible that lists all the 400 or more ways in which we can apparently be mentally ill or disordered. About 1900 there were 3 ways, and now there's 400, so something interesting has happened. And there is an equivalent called ICD, or a more or less equivalent, which is drawn up by the World Health Organization, but both DSM and ICD are used kind of internationally. Now, what's very interesting about the current debate is that a lot of the strongest criticism is coming from the world's most powerful, influential psychiatrists, some of whom were involved in drawing up these manuals. This is not, as perhaps it's sometimes seen in the 60s, the maverick anti-psychiatrists, so-called. This is the very people who drew up these manuals in the first place. So here's a collection of some of my favourite quotes. Dr. Alan Francis, chair of the DSM-4 committee. DSM editions are revised every 10 or 20 years or so DSM-5 is the 5th edition. You know you're in trouble with your 5th edition when one of your chief critics is the chair of the DSM-4 committee. DSM-5 will radically and recklessly expand the boundaries of psychiatry. There is no reason to believe that DSM-5 is safe or scientifically sound. Those are strong words. You know, I get into trouble when I say that kind of thing. He's the man who drew it up. He should know. The former director of the National Institute for Mental Health, the world's largest funding body for mental health, DSM is totally wrong, an absolute scientific nightmare. Dr. Thomas Insall, patients deserve better. The weakness is its lack of validity. I won't bore you with details about reliability versus validity, but if you think for a second, there could not be a bigger weakness than lack of validity. In essence, it's saying we do not know whether this reflects anything that's going on in the real world. In an unguarded moment, in an interview for a newspaper, Dr. Alan Francis admitted, there is no definition of a mental disorder. I mean, you just can't define it. It's bullshit. So I find this very curious because we still are in an age and where people are routinely, every day, thousands of people are told, you have bipolar disorder, you have schizophrenia, and how many of them are also given the addendum, but by the way, you know that's bullshit. Not many of them. None of them, I suggest. So this is that there is no more important question in psychiatry, and I don't just mean psychiatrists when I say that, I mean the whole mental health industry, than the one of diagnosis, because everything depends on this. If these are not medical illnesses in some senses, everything else is up for question. Our language, of course, but the main interventions we offer, which tend to be medical ones, the main professions are involved, doctors and nurses, the main settings we see people in, hospitals and clinics. You know, everything depends on that. So as Dr. Peter Breggin, who's an American critical psychiatrist, has said, if diagnosis cannot be demonstrated to be reliable and valid, we are left asking whether we're left with a medical specialty that does not treat medical illnesses. Can you see how that might be a little problematic? You know, that is what we are faced with. That is the dilemma that we're currently in, and hence these headlines, being a rather sad person of very narrow interests, as my family and friends often tell me. I have a large collection of these, which you don't need to read, but they're coming out every month. These, you know, an awful lot of people have noticed that Western psychiatry is in crisis. Psychiatry is in crisis. Psychiatry seems to have lost its way. Again, it's not psychiatry as such, but the whole mental health enterprise. Is psychiatry dying? It's time to reach beyond diagnostic dependence. This is from a psychiatrist himself, so again, I want to make the point that many psychiatrists themselves are equally concerned about this and have been very brave, I think, in speaking out about it. It's probably easier for them to do than me to do, so I respect their courage. And, you know, there are serious problems. But how many people in the room have somehow from somewhere received the distinct impression that depression, for example, is caused by a chemical imbalance? Yes. Now, I wonder where you got that from, because there is an extraordinary degree of backsliding. Again, at the very top of the psychiatric profession, this guy is a very senior American psychiatrist. The chemical imbalance theory was never a real theory, nor was it widely propounded by responsible practitioners in the field of psychiatry. That's extraordinary. How can this delusional idea have spread so fast and so quickly? And further than that, this is backtracking on a major scale. He has alleged that the idea that psychiatrists once told people that low serotonin was a cause of depression and that antidepressants corrected this chemical imbalance is now said to be a false narrative invented by anti-psychiatry activists. That's people like you and me, folks. Okay, so we're kind of left in a limbo state, whereas Dr. David Kupfer, the chair of the DSM-5 committee, says, we've been telling for patients for several decades we're waiting for biomarkers, actual concrete evidence of the things we have wrongly been told are fact for decades. It's a chemical imbalance. There's some genetic contribution. We're still waiting. And in fact, again, in the world's largest mental health funding body, they recognise this. They are funding research now not based on what causes bipolar disorder or what are the causal factors in schizophrenia, because if these are not valid categories, they're not a good starting point for research. So they are not accepting grants on that basis. They're accepting grants and applications on the basis of things that cut across diagnoses, like, you know, high arousal or anxiety or something like that. But they're not giving up. The diagnostic enterprise, in their view, is not something that needs to be abandoned. They're pouring millions of dollars into what they say is going to be we're finally going to get the scientifically valid diagnostic system. Based on their website, on the front page, it says, on the assumption that mental disorders are brain disorders. I find this very strange. I don't think you have to be a very senior researcher to work out that logically it's not a very good idea to start by assuming what you're trying to prove. We do not know that these are brain disorders, but you can see they're very much still in that mindset. So we're left with circular arguments. Why does this person hear voices, feel so desperate? Because they have schizophrenia or depression. How do they have schizophrenia or depression? Because they hear voices, are so desperate. Insert any diagnosis you like, you know, apart from a few like sort of Alzheimer's and things, for which of course we have evidence of, you know, brain dysfunction. Why does this person have such awful mood swings? Because they have bipolar disorder. How do you know they have bipolar disorder? Because they have such awful mood swings, and so on.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.